Alright everybody, welcome back to Medieval 1450. I hope you are all doing well. So today we are going to dive into a discussion of education in the High Middle Ages. So today we are going to be discussing a subject quite relevant to what this class is, and the subject is education, with a focus on how education was organized and the growth of universities in the High Middle Ages. For starters, let's discuss what education looked like before this period. So, most of the region we've spent discussing was at one point ruled by the Roman Empire. In the regions beyond that in the north, education was informal. It was an oral culture, and while it didn't result in formal education, we should not denigrate the intellectual skills they honed. Remember our sources on Viking warriors and their literary skills. They didn't have a formal education, but their poetry was still clearly valued. But within the bounds of the Roman education system, schooling was commonplace. Done often by tutors, many slaves or former slaves from Greece, it was a way to teach those in the upper rungs on the social ladder. Now, some of the purposes were intensely practical. A large empire required a great deal of administrative load, from taxation to military logistics, and they needed people who were literate to handle it. The same skills applied to commerce run across a large realm. But there was another reason as well. Roman politics required a high degree of fluency with literary references and material. Schools taught this kind of knowledge, and in doing so provided a way for those in the provinces to work themselves into the Roman system. This was, of course, a two-way process. As they learned the material necessary to gain power in the Roman government, conquered peoples became steadily more Romanized. By making Romanness, so to speak, a part of social status, Rome carried out a program of cultural imperialism. But by the early Middle Ages, the system is in full decline. And why might this be? Well, there are several reasons. One, of course, is just the fact that most of the former empire, at least the western half, is under new management. But that isn't the whole story. Many of these so-called quote-unquote barbarians bought into Romanness as a sign of authority. However, as time went on, the importance of that certainly diminished. What contributes to cause the collapse of the Roman education system is also the smaller size of these realms, and governments not so dependent on large bureaucracies. While Rome was a central government, remember how even Charlemagne traveled from county to manage the realm and keep an eye on his vassals. Another problem was the collapse of cities. Large urban areas meant even for an elite that was a small proportion of the population, there were enough to justify schooling. Now, this isn't the whole picture. In the Islamic world, we see the growth of madrasas as formal schooling, as well as the House of Wisdom in Baghdad as the center of this activity. So, the first real stage in creating a new education system began with a man named Cassiodorus. He was an Ostrogoth who lived in Rome for much of the 6th century. Sometime after the sacking of Rome, Cassiodorus was trying to bridge the growing gap between the Latin and Greek Christian worlds, but also to connect the Goths with Roman tradition. With papal support, he founded a monastery and set about training monks to read the Bible. But to teach monks, he found that they needed to develop many skills, and he needed to maintain commentaries on the Bible and other texts as reference to help this training. He is often credited with beginning the practice of monastic copying of texts, which preserved a vast amount of material over the course of monastic history. Over time, the collapse of the education system began to be reversed by the growing number of monasteries and cathedral chapters. Cathedrals chapters being small groups of monks associated with a cathedral, or a church with a bishop's seat. And these preserved some classical texts and encouraged at least some education in those sources. This was furthered by the Carolingian Renaissance, something we discussed back on Carolingian Day. One of the major players in this was Alcuin, who helped to standardize written Latin in the form of what we know as Carolingian minuscule. So that's where we stand at the start of the High Middle Ages. So as we move into this period, we see several forces creating the conditions for a revolution in education. Cities are once again growing, becoming centers of art and culture and places where intellectual ferment occurs. Cathedral schools are expanding to fill the increasing needs of a church that wanted educated clerics to minister to their populations. In addition, as we've mentioned before, the Crusades have opened a lot of contacts in the East, bringing in new texts that require both preservation and study. Now, when we talk about universities, we aren't talking about something directly comparable to what we have today. The term comes from the Latin word universitas, meaning community, universe, or the sum of all things. Those who would be involved in universities understood their role in religious terms, approaching a series of subjects which would be today considered separate disciplines through questions of religion. These universities were formed quite differently than those of the U.S. were. Here, universities were founded, with states or donors contributing a large sum of money to begin hiring faculty and teaching. But in medieval universities, they were formed by a group of intellectuals who came together. Prior to that, education was provided by independent scholars, but universities helped standardize this. There were two ways this happened. The University of Paris was formed by a community of scholars who banded together to establish a curriculum and the requirements of students going through the program. They were effectively a guild of teachers, and they were given formal recognition in 1209. On the other hand, students could be the driving force behind a university. In Bologna, students, many of them foreigners, somewhat older, and law students gathered to set fees and define the standards for masters. Effectively, the university was created from a student union. This was an important approach because students under the direction of instructors can be taken advantage of without clear guidelines. Individual universities tended to develop specialties. Paris became known for its education in theology, while Bologna was known for law. These two universities still competed, though, albeit mostly over which was founded first. Bologna first organized in 1088, while Paris only organized in 1180. However, Paris received a charter in 1209, 21 years before Bologna received a charter. Oxford was up next, organizing in 1208. So, is formation the start of the university, or its founding documents? There's no way to give that a satisfactory answer. Being a student or a teacher gave individuals a status as clergy, which meant no women were permitted to attend. The position as members of the clergy is where the system of robes come from, like those commonly worn today at graduation. From an early date, universities had a pretty standardized program, one which almost every other future university copied. Students spent 4 to 6 years on a bachelor's degree studying the basic information of the curriculum, namely the trivium and the quadrivium, which we'll talk a little bit later. If you wanted to teach, you needed a master's degree requiring oral exams and study of authors like Aristotle and Euclid, and the highest teaching positions required a doctorate in a specialized subject. For example, medicine, theology, or law. This model is almost the same as today, with the sole exception that students often began at the age of 14 back in the Middle Ages. The rise of public schooling has pushed that starting point back. Although subjects and teaching approaches have changed greatly, the underlying system has not faded. So why don't we take a look at one of these rule systems. The first source in your packet for today sets a series of rules for the University of Paris. Now this was written by a papal legate, a representative of the Pope by the name of Robert de Courson. So, why is the Pope getting involved? Well, for one, we've discussed how carrying out church services properly required an intricate understanding of church doctrine. But a proper education system also needs to teach a quote-unquote correct theology, towing at least reasonably close to the core beliefs of the Catholic Church, as one of the purposes of this education and exerting greater papal control over the clergy was to bring them in line. Finally, the Church wanted to express its authority as one branch of the religious structure, how they comported themselves reflected upon the Church. But let's look specifically at the rules themselves. So we have age and education requirements, such as no one shall lecture in the liberal arts at Paris before he is 21 years of age, and he shall have heard lectures for at least 6 years before he begins to lecture. It also specifies elements of the curriculum, such as reading Aristotle, Priscian, and Donatus, as well as what should not be taught. But then we get to a section on how masters should behave, even dress. The rules may sound somewhat like the rules regarding markets and guilds we heard back on Travel and Commerce Day, and the principle is ultimately similar. A specialist organization legitimized and regulated by those in authority. But give some thought to these. What roles does each rule play? How do they meet the objectives of a good education? or the objectives of those regulating the masters. So, onto a bit of the curriculum. In addition to major classical and medieval authors such as Aristotle, Augustine, and later Aquinas, the medieval universities developed an organized curriculum around a classical model. They featured the 7 liberal arts. Today we may think of the liberal arts as a pretty circumcised portion of a school's offerings. But for medieval universities, the study of the liberal arts was of primary importance and fairly all-encompassing. These 7 liberal arts were organized into the trivium and the quadrivium, named for the number of subjects they each included, such as tri and 3 and quad and 4. The trivium consisted of the 3 subjects of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. These were considered subjects of importance for communications and daily use. How to compose spoken and written language, the application of reason to problems, and how to use the Greek concepts of logos, ethos, and pathos to win arguments. Now, if you've never heard of these 3 concepts, it's worth taking a brief look at them. Classical and medieval and much modern study of rhetoric focused on the 3 aspects of ethos, logos, and pathos as building blocks of an argument. Logos is the simple one, the logical reasoning of an argument, such as presenting facts or figures. Pathos is a powerful element of an argument, striking at the emotional response of those hearing the argument. Ethos, the third element, is a little harder to describe, but it is the authority the speaker holds. This could be expressed by the confidence of their speaking or the authority that they present. We'll discuss the concept of authority in medieval intellectual thought later. To use a modern parallel, this is kind of like an actor wearing a lab coat in a pharmaceutical commercial. The selling the products to you by associating it with the resonance of man or woman with a lab coat, so to speak, as a way of demonstrating that the person speaking knows what they are talking about. If you've never done it, a good thought experiment is to study speeches and see how each of them is used. Be suspicious if you come to the end of an argument and find no logos, or if that logic doesn't really hold up. Similarly, ask yourself if they have ethos. Do they strike you as an authority, and is it a sham? And of course, a crucial part is pathos. Does the argument move you on a personal level? But let's move on. The quadrivium was a set of 4 subjects: arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. So why were these a set of subjects? Well, astronomy is an easy one. The study of the stars is still a major discipline and college major, so to speak, to this day, although our model of the universe has changed greatly, such as the sun sitting at our solar system center in place of the Earth, and a lot of astronomy verged more on astrology in the Middle Ages. For example, records of the year 1066 record a comet in the sky. Why is that year significant? Well, hopefully you all remember that in 1066, that is the year that William the Conqueror invaded and conquered England. The comet was interpreted later as a sign of what was about to occur. You can see it here as it was stitched into the Bayeux Tapestry. Now, we know there was no causal relationship. The comet was in fact Halley's Comet, so named for the man who in 1705 realized that it was returning on a regular basis, correctly predicting its next return. Geometry fits in nicely with this. The relationship of numbers and shapes helps us understand the world and had applications to architecture and aesthetics. But music is an interesting one as well. However, if you play an instrument or sing, you've probably realized that music, while an artistic endeavor, is also founded on a series of mathematical relationships of sound. You might be surprised how many engineers actually play instruments. This was a subject driven in part by Pythagoras, a Greek thinker from the 6th century BCE. Besides a geometric theorem, you probably all encountered sometime in school. He also pioneered studies of music, as he and his followers saw the world as ordered by a set of laws which music and geometry could approach explanations of. Oh, and as a side note, he was also a vegetarian. In fact, for millennia, vegetarians were known as Pythagoreans. Now, the final subject is arithmetic. You may hear this and think, that was something I did mostly in elementary school, right? So why would it be a subject for universities? Well, we would today write out numbers in what we call Arabic numerals. They're so named because Europe got the idea and the symbols from the Middle East. But in truth, the number system was developed in India somewhere in the 6th century. The idea of a base 10 number system where you could count upwards and use digit places to extend the size of a number indefinitely spread slowly and took time to develop. In fact, the idea of giving 0 a number is a crucial but late invention. Instead, universities taught arithmetic through Roman numerals, which you can see here on the slide. Now, these are fine for displaying numerical values. We still use them today for bullet points, chapter headings, numbering the Star Wars movies, whatever. But imagine how complicated addition is using this system. If you try, you're probably going to end up converting Roman numerals to Arabic and just adding them that way. Medieval thinkers had no such shortcuts. Subtraction poses a similar problem, but imagine how hard it is to multiply numbers. And division was almost virtually impossible. So don't be quick to judge people on this matter. Arithmetic was serious business for those without the same tools that we do. Okay, so let's imagine what a lecture is like. Here on the side, you can see a medieval manuscript on the far right. The large font script in the center is the actual document of the manuscript, but the smaller font surrounding the larger font is commentary on the text, a text unto itself often provided by renowned scholars themselves. Students would listen as a master read the text and write down the text as they did so. Then the masters would read the commentary on the text. Finally, the master would explain the quaestio of the commentary, and that these were the questions the commentator himself provided in order to address weaknesses within the argument or difficult points that needed more explanation. The process was quite passive and very intensive, with an emphasis on memorization of sources, argument, and concepts. Student life, in general, was just not easy. Students, especially when they started lecturing themselves, were exploited and worked very hard. Food was generally not very good, and books were expensive. Yes, worse food, and, impossible as it may sound, proportionally more expensive books than even today. Consequently, students were also fairly close to being broke, but the problems extended beyond that. Students traveled long distances to go to universities and found themselves foreigners where they studied. This is true today. The issue of town and gown relations is a persistent problem, with students as outsiders even when within the same country. But imagine the size of the gulf in a more insular society where travel and contact with other groups was so much more rare for a student from, say, Denmark to go to a school in Paris. But students caused their own problems and were notorious for their bad behavior. Now let's take a look at some student rules such as the 1257 Statutes of the College of the Sorbonne. So, we mentioned this back when we talked about laws in the early Middle Ages, but I want to return to the idea of descriptive versus prescriptive laws. So, some rules are descriptive. They tell you how you should behave and tell us about society's expectations. For example, the Ten Commandments are descriptive. They give a set of social explanations, laws for society to live by. But other laws are prescriptive. They describe an action that should not be done, but also tell us that such actions are occurring. For a modern example, one study abroad program some friends of mine were on had a rule against drinking alcohol above the first floor in the dorms. Turns out, one of our professors was the cause of it when he fell off a balcony while drunk into some bushes. The rule was prescriptive, a response to an issue observed. So what do we see here? Some of these rules are fairly descriptive, but others are almost definitely prescriptive. For example, descriptions of what you should wear are descriptive rules, but the rule against loud shoes or clothing suggests this is a problem that they felt needed to be policed. Speaking of clothing, why are these kinds of rules enforced? Again, remember that the students are clergy. Clothing was an important part of displaying social standing, and so students were expected to wear clothes that displayed their status as students, not whatever social status their family came from. Many students were the second or younger sons of nobility, who otherwise had no inheritance, and thus displaying their family's wealth could be an issue. Beyond these rules, complaints by masters about the behavior of their students were continual. Then again, although the complaints have changed, complaints about kids these days have never lost their popularity, though students in medieval universities were markedly more violent. Conflict between cities and students often got bloody and even deadly, and large student riots occurred all too often. These riots were generally triggered by these town conflicts, a bit unlike the student riots of the 60s and 70s on social issues or the periodic ones over winning football games, or losing football games. Still, the St. Scholastica's Day riot is one of the worst, when students running amok led to some 2,000 townfolks retaliating, causing the death of 40 to 60 scholars. In response to these issues, students tended to congregate into groups where they would share thoughts and ideas and entertain one another. One of the largest groups were the Goliards, a name given to the wandering students and clerics in medieval England, France, and Germany. They were known for their satirical verses and poems, many of which emphasized the other things they were known for, namely drinking and general debauchery. The text includes a highly entertaining piece by an unknown author known as the Archpoet, which includes the following entertaining stanza. Meum est propositum in taberna mori, ut sint vina proxima morientisori, tunc cantabunt letius angelorum cori, sit Deus propitius huic potatori, which generally translates to, it is my proposition to die in a tavern, so that wine is near to the mouth of the dying. Then the chorus of angels may more gladly sing, may God be merciful to this drunkard. But let's get back to the actual main sort of academic aspects of medieval universities. One of the great intellectual trends that underpinned this university system was scholasticism, a system of teaching theological and philosophical subjects. It was both a way to teach and to investigate academic questions. At its core, scholasticism depended on a process of reason. At its core, it was a process of creating reasoned arguments with the ultimate goal of understanding the world through combining Christian theology and classical philosophy and thought. Key to this were chains of authority. The ultimate authority in the Middle Ages, at least the European Middle Ages, was of course God. But God himself could not be asked questions. Instead, the next level authority was, of course, Scripture. But Scripture does not answer all, or even most questions directly. Instead, it must be interpreted through a process called exegesis. The Church Fathers, writers from the early centuries of the Church, such as St. Augustine, played a pivotal role defining the new faith and were generally the next link in this chain of authority. From there, the next stage is other scholars, generally other clerics, ultimately ending with yourself. But there was another way to access God. The natural world was God's creation, and so the application of logical study of the natural world, as many classical thinkers did, was also a source of knowledge. By using the whole of these chains of authorities and mixing both of them, scholasticism hoped to answer all possible questions. Now you might see a problem here. Both chains of authority are male, from the writers of the scripture to classical figures to church fathers and scholars. This is an issue we'll return to on Gender and Authority Day. For now, let's leave off scholasticism by mentioning how it was taught. Education was done through a dialectic approach, where students would make arguments against each other's position, refining and improving arguments and understanding of issues. Perhaps the most famous question to debate, and most difficult to resolve, was how evil could exist in a world with an all-knowing, all-powerful God. That is not a question we are going to answer here and today. So let's look at a couple of scholastic thinkers as the end of our lecture. Peter Abelard, who lived from 1079 to 1142, was a French philosopher and monk who used the scholastic method in both religious and lay texts. He was something of an academic celebrity and gained quite a reputation. Not always good, even being charged with heresy and treason against the King of France. He was also famous for his relationship with Eloise, a woman who started as his pupil and became his wife before both were ultimately forced into the cloister. She was quite the thinker in her own right. Thomas Aquinas, who lived from 1225 to 1274, may be the single most influential scholastic. His greatest work, the Summa Theologica, was an enormously important authority for later authors. Although some conclusions were rejected as too unorthodox for church doctrine, the quality of his scholarship and its great value made it impossible to reject outright. His work also became a crucial text for learning to understand the Bible. However, part of this was the sheer scale of the work. Such a full summary of many subjects in one text became impossible to top as time went on, subjects expanded, and more authors had to be considered. The general response was a turn towards encyclopedias written by many scholars on one subject. One final thinker I want to mention today is William of Ockham, who lived from 1287 to 1347. An English Franciscan friar and a theologian, he took the perspective that science was the discovery of God's works. For this attitude, one of his approaches became a core method of science down to the present day. If you've ever heard of Occam's razor, it is the principle that the simplest solution tends to be the correct one. Put more fully, whatever solution requires the fewest necessary extra assumptions is more likely to be the real answer. This has application in a lot of fields, but is a founding principle behind the natural sciences. So, by 1500, the universities had spread all over Europe, with some 80 founded in major cities across the continent. Universities produced highly qualified individuals for growing bureaucracies and for the church, but while education certainly was highly controlled, the process of learning itself led people to new ideas and to question what they knew. Such thinking could be quite disruptive, changing people's pictures of how the world and society worked. Ultimately, scholasticism declined as more scholars sought to develop their philosophy from as basic principles as possible instead of relying upon dialogue with previous scholarship. Think René Descartes' I think, therefore I am. But it defined many of the greatest intellectual endeavors of medieval Europe. Our next lecture will turn to medieval performance for a hopefully more lighthearted and less serious topic.